Today we're talking about sex. Today we're talking about specifically don't have bad sex is the idea of today's talk. Don't have bad sex. In seminary, I was told that for an introduction, it should introduce the subject and it should be very, it should grab your attention. I think I did that. We are a church that will talk about what the Bible talks about. And so as we're going through the Ten Commandments, today we're talking about do not commit adultery. But with that, we want to, again, get to the heart level behind the Ten Commandments. As I've mentioned so far throughout this series, for a lot of us, whether it's simply the Bible or the Ten Commandments, often we feel like it's foreign, it's outdated, and if anything, we don't like to be told what to do. We like to trust our own intuition, what we've learned, what we've seen on TED Talks, right? We want to be able to figure out how to live our best life now. But really, what the Ten Commandments tell us is if we trust in God and His wisdom, what it does for us is it enables us to actually live more free. If you know the story of the Ten Commandments, where it was first told, it was told to the Israelites, right? It was told to the Israelites after they were taken out of slavery, right? So they were taken out of slavery so that they may live freely, so that they would be able to worship. And it's in that, as they were freed, God tells them the Ten Commandments. And so for us to understand that these commands do not enslave us, but actually empowers us to live freely. I mentioned this every week the past few weeks. It's the idea of the reason that you get married, the reason you make this commitment, this vow to this woman, to this man that you will marry. It's not to enslave yourself. It's so that you can actually commit yourself to them so that you may love well. Right, that's the idea. So that you may love well. These Ten Commandments for the Israelites, as they're taken out of Egyptian worldview, they now have an idea of this is what it means to love God. This is what it means to love others. So if I was to obey this, it actually enables you to love better. And that's the idea of the Ten Commandments. So open up your Bibles to Exodus 20, verse 14. Exodus 20, verse 14. Each week we've talked about these commandments helping us understand how we can live free. And the idea of today is especially as we live in such a broken world, especially with sex, what does the Bible have to say about that area of our lives? You may not have grown up in a church that sex was ever talked about. For you, you may actually come from a place where for me to talk about sex, for me to even use the word sex may be a bit offensive. But we will preach what the Bible says. And as we're on this command, we will talk about this idea of adultery, at the heart of it, how it actually breaks us. Exodus 20, verse 14, simply says this: "You shall not commit adultery." You shall not commit adultery. The Bible unashamedly addresses the issue of sex over and over and over. And so we don't want to be more prudish than God. If God's willing to talk about it, address it to us, we as a church will do the same. And so with this, we want to talk about the idea of sex and what's bad sex and what's good sex. The purpose of sex. So if you have your bulletin in the front, in the inside portion, you could follow along with me in this outline. And first, we want to understand what sex is. What the purpose of sex. And to understand the purpose of sex, we have to also understand that it's not just physical. Sex is it's not just physical. I'm reminded of a conversation I've had with a friend where he believed sex is purely just physical. It's just you enjoying yourself with somebody else. That's it. It's just chemicals being exchanged. It's just physical. Several months later, his girlfriend was just physical with somebody else. And at that point, he realized it's not just physical. It's so much more than physical. Right? We live in a world where we like to speak from both sides of our mouth. From one side, we'll say it's just physical, it's just pleasure, there's no harm. But from the other side of our mouth, if our loved one has sex with somebody else, we believe that's sacrilegious. It's wrong. It's morally wrong. And for us to understand, this is the culture that we live in. From one side of our mouth, we'll say it's just physical. Just have as much fun as you want. And then from the other side of our mouth, we'll say there are rules that you have to follow by, you have to abide by, because it's precious, because it is important. Sex is never just sex. The world will portray it as it's just sex. But sex is never just sex. And that's why the Bible will address adultery by saying don't ever commit adultery. Because if you commit adultery, it'll destroy your marriage. And God is for marriage. And because God is for marriage, God is against adultery. See, adultery, it's not just sex outside of marriage. It's not just sex outside of adultery is sex outside of marriage that destroys the institution of marriage. Adultery is against marriage, and God is for marriage. And really the 10 Commandments, what it's been telling us is what God is for. It tells us what God is for, and because it tells us what God is for, it tells us what God is against. So the first 4 commandments tells us that God is for a relationship with his people. See, God is against worshiping other gods. God is against worshiping God in vain. God is against for us to live for everything else but God. But so he gives us the Sabbath. God is for a relationship with his people. God is for family, so therefore you should honor your parents. Parents should parent honorably so that children won't be exasperated, but they'll be able to love their parents and honor their parents well. That's why God is for life. He's against murder. And in this we see, when he says do not commit adultery, he is for marriage. The Bible is so for marriage that in Leviticus 20:10 it says this: if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. That was the heart of the Israelite community, that they knew. God knew once you break down family, once you break down marriages, Israel will have no chance of survival. Children would not be cared for in protected homes. And so if you think it's a bit too harsh, once you understand how much God is for marriage, you start to understand the heart behind these verses. Also, if you talk to a spouse that's ever been betrayed, when they hear a verse like this, they know the pain that would lead to a command like that. Because it's not just sex outside of marriage, it's betrayal to the person that you once loved, or you still may even love. Pastor Tim Keller talks about sex in this way: sex is the superglue that seals the bond of marriage. And I think that's brilliant. Sex is the superglue that brings together man and woman who are committed to each other, and it superglues them. It ties them together for that marriage. And with that, I want to define good sex. All sex within marriage is good sex. All sex outside of marriage is bad sex. And for you to understand, that's the premise of how God sees marriage. That's the premise in which how God sees sex. Sex within marriage is good. Sex outside of marriage, no matter how pleasurable it may be, it'll always lead to frustration, loneliness, and hurt. In college, we had a Bible study called Marketplace Bible Study. This was a Bible study for all college students who are leaving campus and were about to enter into the marketplace. And so in the last session of the class, all the students were able to ask any question that they wanted to the senior pastor. Almost 80% of the questions were about sex because you're able to write in the questions anonymously. So for about 2 hours, this pastor has to address all these questions from college kids, and about 80% of them are about sex. Now remember the questions that were asked. The questions that were asked is, in this world that we live in, shouldn't we experiment to see how compatible we are before marriage? Another question that was asked that I remember is, shouldn't we practice sex before marriage so that when we are married, we'd be good at it? Both questions assume that there is a right way to have sex and a wrong way to have sex. But what the Bible says, yes, there is a right way and a wrong way. That all sex within marriage is good because it ties you together. You're vulnerable together. All sex outside of marriage, it will always, always destroy. And then the pastor, I remember him sharing this. He says, wouldn't it be wonderful? Because as college kids, you have this idea of what the marriage night should be like. But he says this, wouldn't it be wonderful if on the wedding night, both couples, both the man and woman, they really didn't know what to do? They really didn't know what really goes on, that you have to basically learn together? I think for us as college students, we're thinking, because initially you're thinking, oh, there's so much shame. I should know what I'm doing. But in that, I think there's something so wise with that. To know that all sex within marriage, it's good. And it should be in the place of marriage that you learn to have sex. The Bible talks about sex often, very, very directly at times. And the Bible tells us how much it is for sex. It's for sex, and it's for sex being had often in the marriage. 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 2 to 5, it should be up in front of you. Let me just read these words, and there isn't much to expound here because it's very, very clear. The Corinthian church, if you knew the church back in the day, the Corinthian church in one sense was the worst church. There were people sleeping around with prostitutes. It was the most young church. And it was also a church planted in the heart of the city. So as people were coming to know Jesus, they didn't know what it meant to follow Jesus. So they would make mistakes. They would make wrong decisions. And in it, as all these people are coming to know Jesus, Paul is now addressing, now as believers, this is how you should actually live within marriage. And he says this, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another. What does that mean? That you would end up having sex regularly. The heart of sex, the point of sex is to unite the married couple together as you explore each other and enjoy each other. It's in that place that you're bonded. But with that, there's a lot of lies that we believe, and that's the second thing we want to address, the lies of sex. Lie number one, God is not for sex. That's a lie that we believe. God is not for sex. People think God has a low view of sex, right? Often you're non-Christian or someone who may not be a believer, they wonder, why are Christians so prudish? How come Christians have such a narrow view of sex? It's not because God has a low view of sex. It's actually because God has a very high view of sex. It's because God is trying to protect sex that he gives commands like this. Because God is the one that created sex. God is the one that knows how powerful it is. And it's in that God is now protecting sex so that you would know how to enjoy this gift. It's not that God is not for sex. He's actually very much for sex. But he knows that it has to have its own rules and boundaries. As he's trying to protect sex, he's trying to protect marriage. So you would have an enjoyable, fruitful marriage your whole life. But the church didn't always get this. And you may actually come from a place where the church never talked about sex. You may even be cringing still as this pastor says sex over and over and over. In the early church, Ambrose, a church leader, said this about sexuality. He said, married couples ought to be ashamed of their sexuality. What's he saying? He's saying, what he's doing is he's bringing the world's view of sex at the time into his own faith. And we don't want to be a people like that. Augustine, one of the early church fathers, brilliant in theology, said this that was wrong. Augustine was willing to admit that intercourse might be lawful, but taught that sexual passion was always a sin. So can you imagine thinking that passion that you have, that drive that you have, is wrong? Imagine what that would do to a marriage. It wasn't until the Protestant Reformation where they devalued celibacy and they glorified marriage, affirmed married sex as both necessary and pure. And so it's in that vein that I want to preach into this culture and help you understand that even though you may be uncomfortable with the pastor talking about sex, the Bible addresses it because the Bible was written in this world, addressing our pains, our struggles, and God has a lot to say about how we control ourselves with sex. God is for sex. Line number 2, sex is intimacy. That's how we view it. If I can't have sex, then I can't be intimate, is a lie that we believe. And I want to be very clear. Sex does not equal intimacy. Sex within marriage will promote intimacy. It'll lead towards intimacy. It'll maintain intimacy. But sex does not equate intimacy. In a book called The End of Sex, the author was a major proponent of the sexual revolution in the 60s, saying that, have as much sex as you want. Decades later, he writes this book, The End of Sex, and this is what he writes after decades of understanding the problems this kind of behavior causes. And he says this, I see now that every game has its rules. I was a proponent of the sexual liberation, but now I see sex has rules. Unless you play by the rules, sex can create a depth of loneliness like nothing else can. Sex can actually lead you to loneliness. Him being a major proponent of the sexual liberation in the 60s now comes to this conclusion, sex has its rules. If you don't play by the rules, it'll actually lead you to misery. There is intimacy to be had in marriage through sex, yes. But let me also say this. There is intimacy to be had without sex as a single. And for you to know that deep within your heart. The Bible will say this. The Bible will say marriage is good. You should hold it up high. And you know what the world says? Yes, marriage is good, hold it up high. But the world will also say, therefore, you should, as a single, strive to be married. This is your goal. But what the Bible will say, what God will say, is it has a high view of marriage, but it also has a high view of your singleness. And for you to be comforted and assured, it's good to be single and it's good to be married. That's what the Bible says. The goal of life is not marriage. And let me be very clear about that. The goal of life is not marriage. Can I repeat that? The goal of life is not marriage.
The goal of life is not marriage.
You can be a single man, you can be a single woman, living a full and complete life. And you could die a single man and single woman, not having been married, knowing with conviction you haven't missed out. Jesus was a single man, lived a full, complete life. Paul calls singleness a gift. It's a gift to be single. If we as singles knew that, how much more comfortable would we be in our own skin? But the world will tell you something else over and over and over. The world will tell you to be single is lesser. Right? To be single, there's something wrong with you. You should be married. Why aren't you married yet? Or they'll equate singleness with loneliness. And so with that, they encourage you to fool around, not knowing that it actually leads to more harm in your own soul. The marriage is up here, and singleness is up here. That's how the Bible tells it. That's how God views it. And with that, what the Bible will also say is marriage is up here then, but then friendship is up here. And as a single, to think that you will live a life without intimacy is false. But to know, especially in the way in which the Bible portrays friendship, is very different than how the world views friendship. For the Bible will talk about friendship as the one who will be with you in the midst of pain, in the midst of hardship. Read through the Proverbs, read through what talks about a friend. It's very different than how we see it today. And so there's intimacy to be had. When you read the friendship of David and Jonathan, some people speculate about King David having an adulterous gay relationship with Jonathan. Why is that? It's because we don't understand what friendship should be. For them to be so close, for them to love each other so much, we read that and we get creeped out because we're thinking, well, that's not right. When the Bible will say that's good. Have friends, love one another, care for each other. There is intimacy, much intimacy to be had as a single. So don't believe the lies. I've seen too many brothers, too many sisters especially, who believe this lie that says, well, I have to be married. So they enter into an illicit relationship, a wrong relationship, getting married to someone that they shouldn't be getting married to. And what happens? They're not any happier. They live a life of misery, a life of regret. Don't make that decision because you believe this lie that only sex equates to intimacy. There's much intimacy to be had as a single. Lie number 3, my sexual struggles are not harming anyone. My sexual struggles, your sexual struggles, it's not harming anyone. I'm not hurting anyone. So what's the big deal? Why would then Jesus say, Matthew 5, 27 to 30, these words? Because Jesus knows it's not good, it's harmful. He says, you've heard it said you should not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. That's how extreme God is, Jesus is, to help us understand how harmful lust is, how wrong it is. It is better then for you to lose one of your members than your whole body to be thrown into hell. What Jesus is doing, he's not simply saying, don't do this for the sake of not doing it. What he's saying is, I've created you. I've created sex. I know how it works. I know how it impacts the heart. And so because of that, do not lust because it will lead you down a path of misery. And it's always true, over and over and over. The more and more you enter into a lustful state, you are led into more misery. Science has proven this as of the past decade. This is one of the reasons I'm a Christian. One of the reasons I'm a Christian is because I've investigated the life of Jesus, his death and his resurrection. I believe it's undeniable what he has done, what the disciples did after that. But one of the other reasons is because when you understand Jesus and what he says, there's so much wisdom. And for me, I've concluded the only way he's understood how the world works, but also how the heart works, is because he created us. And science has now proven how destructive lust is. Cambridge University did this study. They did a scan of the brain as it struggles with pornography. And as he did these scans, they concluded a scan of someone with that addiction of lust, with porn, is the same as one who is a drug addict. That craving that a drug addict has, the satisfaction that it finds through that drug is the same as one who finds that pleasure in porn through lust. They've done these studies where they realize that as you do this more and more and more, you start to create a dependency to porn, just like any other drug addict. So it's been well documented now that porn fuels sex trafficking. So in your mind, when you're thinking, I'm not hurting anyone, you're creating the market for prostitution and ultimately sex trafficking. This is fascinating. Research has also found, and this is not just one research, this is many different groups of research done. And it's exposed this, that porn, after someone watches porn, they rate themselves as less in love with their partner than men who didn't see porn. Meaning after you watch porn, you actually feel less in love with your partner, with your spouse. Other studies have also shown that porn erodes a person's ability to love and feel love with a real partner. And one other research says this, the more porn you watch, the more lonely you become. And so when Jesus says, if that eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out. And he's not saying literally, but he's saying take all the measure possible to protect your own heart from lust. Because when you go down that path, it's an impossible slope to climb back up. And you'll always be led to misery. Always. I know a man who struggled with porn for 40 years. He was an older man. He never thought it harmed anyone or it harmed himself. After he heard the stats of porn one day, he realized this is true of me. Thinking for 40 years, this is not harming anyone. My wife doesn't know about it. But when he heard the research of the effects that porn has on a person, he realized this is me. I don't know how to feel love. I don't know how to love others. I objectify women. And so for you to think that your struggle with porn isn't harming anyone, it's harming you, and it's also fueling the market for trafficking. The fourth lie is this: I'm addicted, I can't help it, this is who I am. Anyone who has ever struggled with an addiction has said these words. This is it. I can't help it. I can't control it. And let me say this. It's okay not to be okay. It's okay not to be okay, but it's not okay to be okay with it. It's okay not to be okay, but it's not okay to be okay with it. I understand why you would struggle with lust. I understand why you would struggle with porn. The addiction is real. The fight is hard. You feel hopeless. You feel like you're in the dark. And what I'm saying to that is, you're not alone. It's a struggle. I get it. But then for you to conclude from there, well, this is who I am. I fought over and over and over, and I can't get out of it. So why fight anymore? And that is not okay. For you to believe that lie is not okay. So, redeeming sex. How do we redeem sex? How do we redeem what we've committed? How do we redeem who we are? One, confess to God. Sex can only be redeemed by God. Only when you give yourself to God, only when you give sex over to God, can you actually fully in your heart be redeemed. Sex is so powerful that they did another study, and they said this: 74% of men would commit adultery if they could guarantee they would never get caught. 74% of men would commit adultery if they could never get caught. 68% of women would commit adultery if they would never get caught. 74% for men, 68% for women. This is how strong the desire is within the heart. And let me just say this. God already knows. God has already caught you red-handed. He knows your heart. And if you feel guilt right now, that's a good thing. It's a good thing because it leads you to then want to change. King David, known after the man after God's own heart, what did he commit? He lusted over a woman so much so that he had her husband killed. And in that act of passion, he writes a poem about the pain that led from that guilt. And this is what he says in Psalm 32:3. For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. My bones wasted away through groaning all day long. I want to say something. I want to come clean, but I kept silent, and it wasted from the inside out. Your struggle with lust is like mold. It grows best in the dark. But if you shed light upon it, you start to see it for what it is, and you have the power to change it. The way in which we often try to fight sin is simply by pure, sheer will. I'm going to fight it, and you fail. I'm going to fight it, and you fail. That's one way to fight sin. That's one way to fight lust. The second way is simply this: to shed light upon it. This is what I struggle with. This is who I am. Brothers, sisters, come around and help me. And the first step of doing that is to confess it to God. I would encourage you to do this. If this is a real struggle for you, I would encourage you to take a moment and just start to write down your own struggle, what you struggle with. Don't just do it in your head, but see it for what it is. And as you go through that exercise, what you will see is you for who you are, a man or a woman who struggles deeply with lust. Take a step back and start to examine your own heart. Questions that you can ask if you were to do this is, when do I commit the sin and how often? Are there different triggers? What's a lie that I believe? Often we believe a lie about it, and because we believe in that lie, we commit that action. The lies may be, well, this will be the last time. No more after this. That's a lie. It doesn't hurt anyone. That's a lie. This will satisfy, and that's a lie. It never satisfies. Never satisfies. And then you could ask yourself, what's the lie behind the lie? Not just what do I believe about it, but why do I do it? You may feel like, it makes me feel like a man. It makes me feel loved. And to address, well, that's a lie too. And start to confront the lies. What excuses do you make? Your excuse may be, my wife is not available to me. If my wife was ... If my husband was ... If I was married, then ... What excuses do you make? But with that, my encouragement to you then would be, what does Jesus have to say about it? Jesus will say, yes, that's a sin. But the sin that I died for, The wrath of God has been paid for it, and I redeem you and cleanse you. And for you to find that longing, that deep longing that you have in God and nothing else. Confess to God. 2, confess if you're married to your spouse. If you're thinking, I don't want to have this talk. I don't want to bring him, I don't want to bring her into the conversation. What you are afraid of is facing reality. Every day that you struggle with this, your marriage grows further and further apart. It's only when you address it and share it with your spouse, you can then come together to help each other out. Let me say this also. First, for those of you who have spouses that will share with you potentially this week, potentially tonight, let me say this, and this is what Stacy Rio says about it as she has experienced it. She says this: if your spouse is addicted to porn, if your spouse is addicted to lust, she says this to you: you are not alone. That you, in your struggle, that you are not alone. That this is not about you. It tells you a lot more about your spouse's addiction than who you are. This is not about you. Help him or help her seek help, lovingly, gently, and share with a trusted friend that you yourself, you need someone else to walk with you in this challenge. Confess to your spouse. 3, share with a trusted friend. You need to shed light upon the sin. If you don't shed light upon the sin, you will never have victory over it. Seek accountability. We at our church, we've tried to help facilitate this. We know it's most natural and best when you find someone that you already know. But if there is no one else in your life, email Peter, email me, and we can try to help you find someone else to battle this. Because my hope is not this. My hope is not for you to feel so guilty and then for us to say, well, you better take care of it. Our desire is to say, you struggle with this, help us help you. And then 4, love your spouse. Recommit yourself to your spouse. Recommit yourself to your future spouse. G.K. Chesterton said this, and I think it's brilliant. For something to be loved, something has to be loved before it becomes lovable. Something has to be loved before it becomes lovable. The world will tell you if it's lovable, then you can love it. But if you're honest with your own heart, what you will realize is if you're honest with your own heart, what you will realize is you can't actually love that well. Initially, it was lovable, but your act of love, your commitment to love, that strength to love, dies out quickly. What G.K. Chesterton says is brilliant. You have to love it, and as you love it, it starts to become lovable. Anyone who has been in a committed friendship or marriage realize the truth of that. As you're committed to one another, you experience a depth of love that you've never experienced before. So as we end, let me address one last question. Is this sin, if I'm so addicted to it, is this sin, does it disqualify me from salvation? Because what I know of Christianity is you have to be repentant. You have to change your heart. But I've struggled with this sin for 5 years, for 10 years, for 15 years. Does it disqualify me from salvation? There was a man and a woman, been married for many, many years. Their marriage wasn't very great, but they coexisted. After years of having this kind of marriage, the woman knew she had to let out a secret. She had an affair at some point before her marriage, when they were engaged, to sometime after their marriage. She broke off that relationship and was simply committed to her husband for many years. And she thought, well, now that I've let this other guy go, now my marriage will heal, and now we can be committed to each other. But she knew she couldn't. And she couldn't carry on this guilt and this burden anymore. So one day she decides, I'm going to tell him. No matter what happens, I'm going to tell him. If he ends up leaving me, then so be it. I can't live with this guilt anymore. She tells him. He, hearing what she had to say, stood up and walked out. She didn't know what he was going to do. She had thought maybe this was the last time I'll see him. She wondered, what am I going to tell the kids? What are the kids going to wonder about where is Dad? Several hours later, he comes back home with a bag, takes her to the bedroom, undresses her, puts on a white, beautiful satin robe on her, and says this, I know the road will be hard, but I choose to see you as how Jesus sees you. When you ask yourself, am I saved if I struggle with this? It's okay that you struggle with it in the sense that it's a real struggle. I'm not saying it's okay to lust, but what I'm saying is it's okay. I understand. What's not okay is for you to be okay with it. Well, this is who I am. And it's that conviction that reveals to you if you're saved. And what I'm saying is this, it's not by works. It's not by works. But what I'm saying is this, if you love Jesus, if you're committed to him, if it means that for the rest of your life you'll struggle with it, but yet you always come back to Jesus, that reveals a repentant heart. A Christian is not one who lives a perfect life. A Christian is one who lives a repentant life. And there's a huge difference there. And if this is a deep struggle for you to know the way in which God sees you right now is with the righteousness of Christ. And for you to claim that and to know that that is your identity, that is your worth. It's all because of Jesus. Let's pray.